All right, thanks again for joining us tonight. We continue our study of the life of Christ. And we left off our study last time in the 11th chapter of John. So we invite you to turn there, and we'll be looking at an unforgettable story concerning the Lord and a family that he knew very well. In John 11 and verse 1, there was a certain man that was sick named Lazarus of Bethany, the town of Mary and her sister Martha. It was that Mary which anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. A family well known to Jesus. We read about Mary and Martha in several other places. Therefore his sisters sent unto him, saying, Lord, behold, whom thou lovest is sick. And Jesus heard that he said to his disciples, he said, This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God might be glorified thereby. Reminding us again that there are times when things that seem bad and unpleasant may serve a higher purpose. Verse 5 says, Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. He loved all of them. It's interesting to note, too, that there are two different words for love that are used here. One is the word used back in verse 3. They sent the message, the sisters did, that the one whom thou lovest, phileo is the word there. It's a word that suggests a feeling of warmth and appreciation of kinship. The word here that the Lord used, agape, is often used in reference to the very highest form of love. It's a love that extends itself not just where there are natural feelings, but a choice to love. And so Jesus loved Mary and Martha and Lazarus. He had an affection for them, and he wanted what was best for them. And so verse 5 tells us about his love, and verse 6 tells us something that seems contrary to that. When he heard, therefore, that he was sick, he abode 2 days still in the same place where he was. There was a higher purpose going on here. We normally would think that someone in that situation would just rush off to be with their friend whom they had heard was sick. But in this case, the Lord remained where he was, whether that was in Perea or some other place. And then after he said, Let us go to Judea again. The disciples were hesitant about that. They said, Master, the Jews of late sought to stone thee. Goest thou hither again? And the Lord's response to that was not to deny the fact, because it was true. He had been threatened. He had escaped recently in his latter trips to Judea. Their opposition was growing more bold and more ferocious and more evil. But the Lord said to his disciples, he said, There are 12 hours in the day. If any man walk in the day, he stumbleth not, because he sees the light of the world. A man who walks in the light, he knows where he's stepping. He has no reason to fear. But in the darkness, you don't know what's coming. That's the place you ought to be afraid. I think the Lord's point was, when you're doing the right thing, you have no need to fear. It's doing the wrong thing that ought to make us afraid. Those that walk in darkness that ought to fear and be hesitant. Verse now 11, These things said he, and after he saith unto them, Our friend Lazarus sleepeth. I go that I may wake him out of sleep. And the disciples said, Lord, if he sleep, he shall do well. But Jesus spake of his death, but they thought that he had spoken of taking a rest in sleep. Jesus said to them plainly, Lazarus is dead. I'm glad for your sakes that I was not there, to the intent that ye may believe. Nevertheless, let us go unto him. Jesus, in the first place, makes this statement, this comparison of death with sleep. We ought not to misunderstand that. Nowhere in the Bible are we taught that the spirit sleeps after death. Soul sleeping is not a biblical doctrine. We were just looking at the story in Luke the 16th chapter in our last study. It's evident that here were two men in the story of rich man and Lazarus that died But certainly with the rich man, there was no question that he was highly conscious of his suffering afterward. And there's no indication that Lazarus was unconscious. The sleeping and the connection there comes with the body, which in death may look like it's in slumber. But the word death itself suggests the idea of separation. When you think about the concept of death, however it might be used in the Bible, it always has at the root this idea. In physical death, the idea of the body and the spirit separating. The spirit is not unconscious, but it's no longer in the body. It goes where it goes. It goes to the realm of the unseen as far as we're concerned. We can't see the spirit. The body, we know what we do with that. But when he talks about death and makes that comparison, that's what he means, is that the body appears to be sleeping. In this case, Lazarus was not sleeping in the sense of a rest, as he says, but rather that his body and spirit had parted. He had died. And Jesus said, I'm glad that it happened. I don't think he was glad for their tears or their sorrows, but he was glad that it happened, he said, because God's going to teach a lesson. He's going to use this for a purpose. We have to try to look at life that way. That promise that Paul made in Romans 8, all things work together for good, doesn't mean that everything that happens is pleasant, or even that everything that happens is good, but all things work together for good. And I think we see that, an example of that in this story. It's interesting in verse 16. Then said Thomas, which is called Didymus, unto his fellow disciples. This is the famous Thomas, so-called doubting Thomas. Sometimes Thomas gets, I think, an unfair shake in this thing. But Thomas actually was a great man, as all the apostles were. Judas being an exception, but all of those faithful apostles were great men. Some of them made their mistakes in terms of their choices as young men. They may have not always said the right thing at the right time. But here, Thomas, I think, expresses a noble spirit when he says, let us go that we may die with him. They were very much concerned about going back to Judea. And they were concerned about the enemies. They knew how serious they were and how ferocious they were. And the disciples had tried to tell the Lord, let's not go back there. Jesus said, we've got to go. We've got work to do, and we must work while it's day. And their attitude was, well then, Lord, we'll go with you. And if we die, we die. I don't know if I made this point previously, so I'll make it again. You'll forgive me if I'm repeating myself. But I think it's a good point for all of us to remember. And the younger we learn this, the better. We talk about courage and cowardice. Courage is not the absence of fear, and cowardice is not feeling fear. Cowardice is being ruled by fear, and courage is mastering our fear, doing the right thing even when we're afraid. And I think this is a good example of courage. Here the disciples were, and they certainly felt uneasy about going, but they said, we're not going to let him go alone. We're going with him. This is our Lord, and we'll be with him to the end. And I think that spirit we hopefully can learn from. That in life we're going to find times when we're afraid, but we know what's right, so we're going to do what's right despite our fears. That's what real courage is about. Anyway, let's get back to the text now. In verse 17, and then Jesus came, and he found that he had lain in the grave 4 days already. The Jews usually counted a part for the whole. So when you think about Lazarus being in the grave 4 days, if he died the day that Jesus heard he was sick, and then that would have been day 1, the next 2 days, 2 and 3, and then the day that Jesus got there would have been 4. And so the idea of 4 days would be counted in that fashion. And so now Jesus comes, and he knows that Lazarus has been dead and in the grave for some time. Bethany was not far from Jerusalem, though it doesn't seem Jesus is in Jerusalem at this time. He's outside of Judea when he comes there. Verse 19 says that many of the Jews came to Martha and Mary to comfort them concerning their brother. It may seem unusual to you, but in the Eastern cultures it was not uncommon for professional mourners to come. When they heard that someone in the community had died, you'd have a group of professional mourners who were especially intense in their weeping and their wailing in order to give somebody the proper send-off and make sure that enough crying had been done. I don't know if any of those folks in this crowd or not. I do think it's fair to say, looking at the story as a whole, that there were people in that crowd who just did not truly have the spiritual perspective that they should. And even the heroes of our story here, Mary and Martha, great women that they were, we can see that there was some wavering with them. They didn't understand what was going on, and they just knew they hurt. They knew they felt their loss. So anyway, going back to the story here, these mourners are surrounding Mary and Martha. There's a great deal of uproar, it seems, in all of this. Martha hears that Jesus is coming. Somebody has tipped her off about that. And so she slips out to go and meet Jesus up the road. And verse 20 says that Mary abode still in the house, apparently not being aware of this. In verse 21, sorry about that, verse 21, Martha meets Jesus, and it seems the first thing out of her mouth are these words, Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died. There's almost a mild rebuke in those words. Lord, I know if you just made it earlier, this wouldn't have happened. Well, verse 22, she follows that up with a great statement of faith. She says, but I know that even now, whatsoever thou wilt ask of God, God will give it thee. Verse 23, Jesus said to her, thy brother shall rise again. And Martha said unto him, I know that he shall rise again in the resurrection at the last day. That's interesting, isn't it? But Martha starts off with just a bit of regret. Maybe it's not a rebuke of Jesus, it's just a sadness about the circumstance. Oh Lord, I wish you'd have been here, he wouldn't have died. But I know that even now being after he's dead, I know that now you can do whatever. God will work through you to do whatever your Father will. But then, just a minute later, she says, well, I know at the last day he's going to be raised. I think that Martha's mindset here seems to wander back and forth a bit. Great woman that she was. Her faith at one point says, I know now that you can do anything. Well, I know later you're going to do something. And the Lord picks up on that. She talks about the resurrection of the last day, which is a fact, it's true. But the Lord has something else in mind for her and for her brother. And Jesus, verse 25, said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. I am the resurrection and the life, Jesus said. He that believes in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Believest thou this? Well, that's a mouthful. What did the Lord say? Well, he said some things very important. In the first place, he says, I have the power. I am the resurrection. I am the life. He said, he that believes in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. It's a way of expressing something that gets attention, doesn't it? In the first place, Jesus talks about those who are dead and yet living. What did he mean by that? I think he was pointing to the contrast between physical death and spiritual death. A man like Lazarus, yes. He died in the sense that he was separated, body and spirit, but he's not separated from God. Yet he lives. Now, he's not asleep, he didn't go out of existence, he lives. And then he adds to that, talking about yet shall he live. A person who's died, every person who dies in faith will live again. And in another sense, in verse 26, whosoever lives and believes in me shall never die. There's a sense in which The godly never die. Now, they may die physically, but in the much more important sense of dying spiritually. What do we mean by dying spiritually? Again, think about that word death. It means separation. Physical death is the separation of the body and the spirit, right? Spiritual death would be a separation. What kind of separation? The separation of man from his God. That's spiritual death. And when we leave this life in that state, it's eternal death. There is no hope of a reconciliation. Now, Jesus' promise is, for those who follow me, they never have to know that kind of death. They can hold to me and be faithful by the grace that God provides. They never have to be separated from me. Oh, they may die. Think about Lazarus, for example. We looked at him, not our Lazarus here, but the Lazarus of Luke 16. That beggar who seems to have been, though he was lacking much in this life, he seems to have been very beloved of God. Now, that relationship got even better after this life was over. Lazarus, the beggar, trusted in God his whole life through suffering and difficulty, and when he died, he was received into the realm of the righteous. Never dies. The godly man may die physically, but he never dies in the way that really counts. It goes from one world, this world, to the next, as we are accepted into that heavenly realm by our Father who loves us, who watches over us here, and who accepts us at that time to be with Him forever. You know, the older we get, I'm talking to some young folks, and I think when we're young, it's hard to even consider. But I think it becomes more and more comfort to us as we grow older and we recognize the fact that our time is more and more limited. We don't know the day of our death necessarily, but we do recognize that every year, every decade that goes by, we have past middle age at some point. And I think it is a great comfort, these words of Jesus. Whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. He wasn't promising we would not face physical death, separating ourselves from this life and from the body. But there was a promise that in all of that, we don't really die in the way that we think about being separated from God. Spiritual death is not a part of the picture for those who hold to God. And the earlier we learn that lesson, the better. We don't fear death then. We have comfort and confidence in God's promise. Okay. Going back to the text here. Jesus asked the question. Now, Martha, you've told me you know that God even now will do whatever. And you've talked about the resurrection day. But I'm telling you, I am the resurrection. Do you believe that? And Martha speaks, and again, I'm not in any way belittling her. I'm saying that all of us sometimes can say big words and we can sing beautiful concepts, but then turn around 5 minutes later and say something that suggests that we really are of two minds about it. Do you believe this? 27. She said to him, Yea, Lord, I believe that thou art the Christ, the Son of God, that should come into the world. Well, we'll hear again from Martha in just a moment. Let me go to verse 28. When she had said so, she went her way and called Mary, her sister, secretly, saying, The Master is come and calls for thee. And as soon as she heard that, she arose and she came unto him quickly. There was no hiding her excitement. She didn't slip out of the house. She bolted out of the house, it seems, and headed for Jesus. Now, those who were around her, they didn't know why she was leaving. They assumed she was getting up to go to the tomb to weep. So they all followed her. So now it's quite a crowd that's coming to meet Jesus outside of town where he has met with Martha. Verse 32, when Mary was come where Jesus was, she saw him and she fell down at his feet. And she said, Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died. That sound familiar? The exact same words that were used by Martha. You know that over and over again, since Lazarus had died, Over and over again they had said those words to each other. If only the Lord had been here. This wouldn't have happened if the Lord had been here. Jesus, therefore, verse 33, saw her weeping, and the Jews also weeping, which came with her. And verse 33 says, he groaned in his spirit and was troubled. The word here for groaned is a word in the Greek language which literally goes back to the idea of to snort, to breathe heavily. Now, it may have different connotations. Sometimes a person may do that in anger or in disgust, or sometimes in exasperation, or sometimes in sadness. We talk about sighing. Maybe sometimes we think about it with chagrin. I don't know if that's a word we use very much, but we know what that is. When something happens that we just... And I think it troubled the Lord that there was such confusion and such short-sightedness about all of this. And so he groaned in his spirit and was troubled. I think it hurt him to see the pain of these people, especially of Mary and Martha. And he was troubled by this. And he asked the question, where have you laid him? And they said to him, Lord, come and see. Verse 35 now suggests another emotion. It's not just chagrin, but it's also real sorrow. Jesus wept. He cried for the tears of those who were crying. He felt what they felt. Verse 36, the Jews said, oh, how he loved him. They saw the tears of Jesus and they thought, oh, this was a dear friend. That is Lazarus that's gone. But some of them said, verse 37, could not this man which opened the eyes of the blind have caused that even this man should not have died? More sighing. He groans at himself and he comes to the grave. The grave was not as we think of it in most cemeteries. This was a cave. They buried in tombs. Of course, we know it was the Jewish practice at that time not to embalm. And so the burial would take place very quickly. You know, the body, from those who know better than I do, dealing with such things, I've heard professionals talk about how quickly the body decays without some treatment of the body. It's remarkable how God has set this matter up. We turn back to dust, or we begin that process in short order. And so Lazarus has been buried in a cave. And after several days, that process, no doubt, you would think would have begun. That's why in verse 39, Jesus comes to the grave and he says, take away the stone. And Martha objects. Again, sweet Martha, but Martha, the woman who said, I know now, even now, anything you ask, God will do. I know one of these days he's going to rise from the dead. I believe you're the Son of God. Oh Lord, you don't want to do that. I can see myself in this great woman. I can see myself in this mindset that here is this woman who, on the one hand, has many noble ideas and a good heart, but we sometimes can talk a better game, and it takes a while for our heart to really catch up to what our head to catch up, I guess, to what our heart's saying. So Jesus says to her, now, didn't I tell you that if you believe, you should see the glory of God? And so they took away the stone from the place where the dead was laid. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and he prayed. And he prayed, Father, I thank thee that thou hast heard me. I knew that thou hearest me always, but because of the people which stand by, I said it, that they may believe that thou hast sent me. I think the unbelief and the uncertainty of the crowd was a large reason why Jesus sighed and was troubled. He not only sympathized with their pain, but he also was disappointed in some of their lack of faith. Verse 43, when he had said thus, now he directs his voice to the tomb. And he says, Lazarus, come forth. And he that was dead came forth, bound head and foot with grave clothes. And they wind him up in a shroud, and tie the jaw taut so that it won't hang loose. And here's this man that's been buried. And instead of being in decay, he comes forth alive. And Jesus said, "Loose him and let him go." It was a remarkable miracle, and one that still we stand in awe of. Well, verse 45, many of the Jews which came to Mary and seen the things which Jesus did believed on him, of course. But there were some of them went their way to the Pharisees. Why would they go there? There might have been some who were trying to show them, "Oh, look at what this man has done. You don't have much friendliness to him, but this man," and others may have been tattling, warning even the Pharisees. And the chief priest and the Pharisees gathered together in a council, and they said, "What in the world are we going to do? This man doeth many miracles. What do you mean, what are we going to do? What we ought to do is just go bow at his feet and say, 'You are everything you claim to be. God has proven that by what he's allowed you to do. You are the Christ. You are the Son of God. No man who was an impostor could do this.'" No, that's not what they did. That's not what they were afraid of. They were just so sure this man was an impostor, that he was a radical, that he was dangerous, that he would wind up leading a rebellion against Rome that would turn out to be a disaster for the whole nation. They were so set in their own ideas that they couldn't even consider giving in. They just wondered, how are we going to get around this? You're going to meet folks in life who have stopped reasoning. When the Lord talked about the sin that could not be forgiven, not in this world or the world to come, I think he's talking about the very spirit that could look at a miracle done by the Holy Spirit and say, "Oh, that's the devil's work." People that close-minded, that hard-hearted, there's just no way to touch them, no way to reach them. And so they were all concerned, because how are we going to stop this man? When they ought to be concerned about, how can we get him to forgive us? How can we serve him? Well, Caiaphas spoke up. He was the high priest that same meeting, verse 49. And he said, "Oh, you don't know anything." He said, "Don't you know that it's expedient for us that one man should die for the people and not the whole nation should perish?" Now, what he meant by that was, all we got to do is kill this guy, and the threat to the nation, what they meant by threat is, he's going to lead a rebellion, the Romans are going to get mad and come in at us and wipe everybody out. By the way, that happened anyway. Not by Jesus doing, but about 40 years later from this time, it would be a rebellion led by others that would bring the judgment of God upon the Jewish nation because of their killing the Son of God. But to Caiaphas, he thinks, if we just kill him, I know we don't really like to kill folks, but if we just kill him, this whole thing will settle down. But think about his words. It's expedient for us that one man should die for the people. He told more truth than he knew, because that's exactly why Jesus had come, to die for the sins of man. And God would use it as an instrument of salvation. This wicked, hard-hearted man meant nothing good about it. And God ultimately would punish him after he used him to accomplish his purpose. Verse 51, "This spake he not of himself, but being the high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus should die for the nation. And not for the nation only, but also that he should gather together in one the children of God that were scattered abroad," John adds. And from that day forth they took counsel together to put him to death. It won't be too long now. The spring is upon us, and the time of the Passover is soon coming, in which the Lord will lay his life down, one man for the people. Verse 54 closes out. "Jesus walked no more openly among the Jews, but went hence into a country near to the wilderness, into a city named Ephraim, and there continued with his disciples." Some of these villages, it's hard to be certain about where they were, but it seems that for a short time Jesus, having left Jerusalem, went up to a place, people think Ephron, or Ophrah might be the area where he's referring to here. But soon he'll make his way back to Galilee and then back down for the last time, coming to Jerusalem. And that's where we are in our study. Let's look at the book of Luke just a moment and notice a quick note here. And then we want to go to Matthew. But in Luke chapter 17 and verse 11, it came to pass as he went to Jerusalem that he passed through the midst of Samaria and of Galilee. Having gone back to Galilee now, he's making his way back down south for this last journey. And as he entered into a certain village, there met him 10 men that were lepers, which stood afar off, and they lifted up their voices, and they said, Jesus, Master, have mercy on us. In our days of quarantine, maybe we can relate a little bit more. In the old law, the leper was to be an outcast. He was to make himself an outcast. Leprosy is a term that's broad enough to, I think, cover a number of different kinds of diseases. Some of them were communicable diseases, and so the idea is that such individuals had to separate themselves, and that was a great suffering on their part. So they, from a great distance, cry out to Jesus, recognizing who he is and saying, Lord, you can help us. Lord, you can make us whole. We beg you to help us. Well, in verse 14, having asked for mercy, they received this message from the Lord, go and show yourself to the priest. That was also a part of the law. If a man had a condition, he was diagnosed with leprosy, some of those diseases got better. Some of them could indeed run their course. A person could be cured. But the priest was the one who looked at this man and pronounced him to have the leprosy, and it had to be the priest who would look at him again to pronounce him to be clean. So Jesus sends them, go and show yourself to the priest. And it came to pass that as they went, they were cleansed. They didn't know they were cleansed until they got on the way. And then they realized, it's gone. It's gone. We're whole again. Verse 15 says, one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, and with a loud voice glorified God, and fell down on his face at his feet, and gave thanks. And guess what? Of all people, he was a Samaritan. The Samaritans were a despised race. You remember they came, a people that were formed from the northern tribes of Israel when they were taken captivity back in the year 721 BC. The Assyrians took them captive, and then in order to repopulate the land, brought some of the Assyrians over to live in Israel in their old homes. And those people, the transplants, with those who were left in the land, intermarried, and a people, the Samaritans, came from that. They were folks who claimed to have some reverence for Jehovah, but were not really faithful at all to keeping the law of Moses. They were in great rivalry with the Jews, and they were quite literally despised by the Jews. In fact, we find many times Jesus' enemies, if they want to insult him, they just say, oh, you're a Samaritan. And just as a pejorative, as an insult. Well, here we find, second time we've seen this in one of Jesus' stories, where the hero is a Samaritan. What an unlikely character, we might think. And yet, as far as God was concerned, he was the one that had it right. When this Samaritan comes back to meet Jesus and to give him thanks, he comes by himself. And the Lord remarks on that. He said, were there not 10 cleansed? Where are the 9? There was a sort of a fellowship of the miserable there. These lepers hanging together, trying to help each other out. Once they're healed, I don't know where the 9 went. He doesn't tell us where they went. Maybe they went on to the priest. Or maybe they went home. Or maybe who knows. But the one that was the Samaritan did the thing that should have been done. He had recognized immediately he needed to go back and thank Jesus for the healing that he had received. And he did just that. The Lord remarked in verse 18, He said, There are not found that return to give glory to God, save this stranger. And then He told him, Rise, go thy way, thy faith hath made thee whole. All through the years, this story has been a good reminder about the need to express thanks. It's important to feel thankful for the blessings we receive, but it's not enough to feel thankful. It's essential to express our thanks. And that's what this man does. He's not the most likely candidate to have that reverence, but he's the fellow that shows it. And I hope you and I can follow his example. It seems a natural thing for some people, and it's good. When they get in trouble, they can get on their knees and they can beg God's help. But those same folks, some of them may be slow to remember to get on their knees and thank God for answered prayers, to thank God for the blessings that we receive, to thank God when He saves us from some peril or some pain or danger. And they can teach us, this man can teach us a great deal, I think, about having the right spirit. Okay, let's look at one more story if we can, going back to Matthew the 19th chapter now. Again, we're making this journey. The Lord has gone back to Galilee, and now He's making His way back to Jerusalem. But He doesn't seem to come down this mountain road. He seems to go along through Samaria and then make His way over. Verse 19, chapter 19 tells us, It came to pass that when Jesus had finished these sayings, He departed from Galilee, and He winds up at the coast of Judea beyond Jordan. So maybe even back over in Perea, somewhere in this area. Great multitudes followed Him, and He healed them there. On this journey to Jerusalem, there still are plenty of folks who are looking for Jesus, hanging on His every word, and even the enemies who are watching Him, scouting Him, spying on Him, still trying to trip Him up. And we find that on this occasion. We're reading Matthew's account of a story that's told to us also in Luke 10. But in Matthew 19, the Pharisees came to Him, tempting Him and saying, Is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? First off, in the Old King James, the term put away is used interchangeably with divorce. I think the word is apaluo here, to loose from. It's not any different. In fact, sometimes the King James Version uses the word divorce, translating the same word. So let's not be mistaken about that. When he talks about a man putting away, he means divorcing his wife. Now, what the Pharisees were trying to do, it seems, is to embroil Jesus into an old argument that the rabbis had among themselves. They had read the law of Moses, and there were some who read the law of Moses, and they saw it to be quite loose, that a man might put away his wife for every cause. And one school of the rabbis thought it to be more restrictive. And so these Pharisees come asking this question, knowing that whatever he says, he's going to make somebody mad, he's going to disappoint one school of thought or the other, just trying to find anything they can to blunt his influence and his popularity. The question they ask, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? Notice that. They don't even talk about remarriage at this point. That's not the question. The question is it lawful to divorce for every cause? Jesus does not at first go back to the law of Moses, to any school of thought among the rabbis. He goes back to the beginning. He answered and said to them, verse 4, Have ye not read that He which made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. Just a quick note here as we go through. Jesus goes back to the beginning, where God made male and female. There are two genders, by the way. And all of the nonsense and all the popularity of contrary thinking notwithstanding, the truth is that Jesus recognized that God made woman for man, and that's the marriage relationship as God recognized it from the beginning. You'll hear people say Jesus never addressed the idea of same-sex marriage. He absolutely addressed it in this passage when He authorized a man and a woman as God had created it to be so as God created marriage. It was God, the Creator, who said, "For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and cleave to his wife, and they two shall be one flesh." In verse 6, they're no more two, they're one flesh, and what God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. Notice again, here's the answer to the question. What was the question? Is it lawful to divorce your wife for every cause? What's the answer to that? No. Jesus said it this way: what God joined together, let not man put asunder. It's not lawful to put away your lawful wife. It does not please God. Now that's the rule, that's the law. They're not satisfied with that teaching. And so in verse 7 they say to him, well then why did Moses command to give a writing of divorcement and put her away? Moses, if you go back to Deuteronomy 24, the law of Moses did say that if a man marries a woman and he finds some uncleanness in her, he doesn't specify what uncleanness is, some literally matter of nakedness, some shameful action, something about her that's shameful. If he finds, it's not adultery that he's talking about there. There was another remedy for adultery. It was a capital offense under the old law. But the idea is if there's something shameful about her and her conduct, then you may give her a bill of divorcement and send her out of your house. And the law had some other things to say about that. But the law did allow that. And they wonder, what about what Moses said? Moses said we could put her away. Why did Moses command to give her a writing of divorcement and put her away? And he said, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, suffered you to put away your wives. From the beginning it was not so. The law of Moses made certain accommodations and arrangements in order to protect women from being just put out of the house. There had to be a bill given to her that she might be able to join another man that would appreciate her more. That's, Jesus said, the law made an accommodation to protect the wife in that case. But he said, I'm talking to you about God's original intent. From the beginning it was not so. It was to be the husband and the wife, two being one flesh, and what God joined together let not man put asunder. Now when you do otherwise, you violate the law of God. And then if you go from that to adding somebody else into the picture, you add adultery to the crime. I say to you, verse 9, whosoever shall put away his wife except it be for fornication, and shall marry another. For the first time we have another marriage, a remarriage, that is enters the picture here. And Jesus said you just add sin to sin. In the first place, you put asunder what God joined together. That's sin. In the second place, now you've added adultery to the sin by having put away your wife and married another. And then he adds to that, whoever marries her that is put away doth commit adultery. What is the law that we find here? The law is, don't put asunder what God joined together. And in reference to divorce, does anybody have a right to divorce? Yes, under this circumstance. If you put away your wife for the cause of her fornication, then you can do so without blame, and you can marry without blame, remarry without blame. But for someone to be put away and marry another, that's adultery. For a man to put away his wife and marry another, that's adultery. Now it's amazing to me that brethren through the years have read this passage and they find all kind of loopholes, and they've just decided that actually this law is not strict at all. I'll tell you, the first folks that heard this law thought it was strict. The disciples, when they heard this, they said to him, it's just good not to marry. If we're that tied together to our wife, better not to marry. Jesus said, all men cannot receive this saying. The Lord wasn't talking about his words, his teaching. He was talking about the statement of the disciples that it's good not to marry, just to forbear marriage. Jesus said there are some eunuchs. For our purposes, eunuch just simply means someone who does forbear a marriage relationship and the sexual relationship in marriage. He said there are some eunuchs which were so born from their mother's womb. There's some who just because of birth, because of the way that they are made, they were physically not appropriate for marriage. There are some, he says, that have been made eunuchs of men. It was not uncommon in the courts of some of those Oriental kings for their courtiers to be eunuchs. made so. And then he said there are some that have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. I don't think that's self-mutilation. I think it has to do with self-control. But anyway, in this case, Jesus said there are some who may follow the path of the eunuch. And some may be forced to do that because of misconduct in the past. But he said, he that's able to receive it, let him receive it. For a man who has the right to marry, you don't have the right to refuse marriage to one, again, who could be a lawful spouse. Okay. I think we'll have to stop there. I appreciate so much your kind attention. And we will not have a class next week, but Lord willing, we will begin to make up this time when we get back. So I thank you so much for joining us. And if you have a question, always feel free to ask that. These are important matters, and I hope that you find them to be useful and helpful in your study of the Word of God. But again, thank you so much for listening, and we'll look forward to being able to be with you again soon.